Ramsey had been working for over 30 years at Hope Grove Cemetery, an old dusty burial ground on the outskirts of a small town in rural Arkansas. His days followed a quiet, methodical rhythm, unchanging, uneventful. He knew every inch of that land, every twisted tree, every sunken grave that time had swallowed. His skin was weathered, his back curved from decades spent with a shovel in hand. He'd long stopped asking questions and believed only in what his eyes could see. His world was dirt, sweat, and silence. That Monday afternoon, like many before it, the heat clung to his skin and the cicadas hummed in a relentless chorus as he walked the narrow stone paths. He was just putting his tools away when he heard the hurried footsteps of Julian, the manager, approaching with a paper in hand. "Ramsey, I need an extra grave opened. It's urgent. Here's the exact spot," he said, skipping any form of greeting. Ramsey let out a quiet sigh and took the paper. The marked location made him raise an eyebrow. It was the old Section D, a remote patch near the back wall where no one had been buried in ages. He couldn't even recall the last time a grave was dug there. Without a word, he returned to the shed, grabbed his shovel, pickaxe and hoe, and began the walk. As he moved farther, the scenery began to shift. He left behind the neat mausoleums, the shiny plastic vases, and the ceramic portraits smiling into nothing. The closer he got to the forgotten section, the heavier the air felt. Grass was sparse, the soil paler. Headstones leaned crookedly, as if time itself had defeated them. Names had been washed away by rain, and rusty crosses were crumbling in the weather. Ramsey found the small wooden stake marking the site. He removed his hat, hung it on the hose handle, and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He drew in a deep breath and spat into his palms, the same way he always did before starting. He adjusted his stance and drove the pickaxe down with force, but the sound wasn't right. It wasn't the soft thud of metal breaking through earth. It was sharp, metallic, like striking steel. The impact shot through his arms and rattled his teeth. He struck again, harder, the same sound, the same resistance. He paused, frowning. The ground wasn't behaving like soil. It didn't shift, it didn't yield. And for the first time in decades, real uncertainty crept into his thoughts. If you're drawn to stories like this one, hit subscribe, ring the bell, and tell us in the comments about the most unsettling moment you've ever lived through. Because what Ramsey was about to uncover was unlike anything he'd ever faced. He stepped back, flipped the pickaxe in his hands, and lifted it again above his shoulder. The afternoon sun burned against his neck like a branding iron. With a low grunt, he struck a few inches to the side. The same sound. It wasn't dirt, it wasn't rock. It was like hitting a sheet of metal that shouldn't be there. The jolt reverberated through the wooden handle, numbing his fingers. He let out a harsh sigh and tossed the pickaxe aside. He picked up the shovel. Maybe it was just a buried piece of scrap, some leftover from construction years ago. He tried scraping the surface, but the shovel simply slid, as if gliding over polished glass. It didn't raise dust. It didn't move a thing. He knelt and pressed his fingertips into the soil. It looked like dirt. It even smelled like it, but something felt off. He rose slowly, a strange pressure building in his chest. The oppressive heat that had lingered all afternoon began to fade. A sudden gust of wind, dry and cold, slipped between the rows of graves, rustling dead branches. Ramsey froze. The air wrapped around him, and then he heard it. It wasn't clear at first. He mistook it for an insect buzzing or a leaf dragging across the path. But as the silence closed in, he realized they were words, a whisper. He held his breath, narrowing his eyes to listen. There they were, voices, soft, female, aged, and though they faded almost instantly, he swore he heard them. "Not here!" His heart skipped. He turned sharply, scanning behind him, between headstones, into the shadows. No one, not a soul in sight, no visitors, no co-workers, just him. Him and the air, now heavy, suffocating. The shovel slipped from his grip, landing with a dull thud. He stood motionless, eyes wide, sweat chilling as it traced down his temples. He felt a prickling at the back of his neck, like someone was standing right behind him, breathing. It was absurd. He was alone. And yet, something deep inside, an instinct buried under decades of doubt, was screaming at him to leave. Right now. Don't look back. And he listened. He walked away quickly, breaking into a clumsy run, dodging headstones, his heart pounding. He just needed distance. To be far from that corner of the cemetery that, for the first time, didn't feel like a resting place, but like a zone where the living were not welcome. That night, Ramsey barely touched his dinner. He replied in short murmurs, eyes fixed on the television, though he wasn't really watching. His wife, Diane, noticed his tense face, but didn't ask. She was used to his long silences. What she didn't know was that inside, Ramsey was stuck reliving the exact moment he heard that voice, or whatever it was, within the wind. Later, in bed, he tossed and turned. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shovel slipping across that soil. He heard the whisper again, directionless. In his dreams, he returned to Section D, only now he had no tools. Just him and the earth, watching him like a quiet judge. He woke soaked in sweat, heart pounding, breath shallow. The clock read 4:13 a.m. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face with both hands. He felt old, tired, and above all, unsettled. The next morning, he made himself the strongest, most bitter coffee he could brew. Diane watched him from the kitchen, saying nothing. She knew better than to disturb these silent spells of his. When he arrived at the cemetery, the sky was clear, but he felt a shadow clinging to his back. He walked with purpose toward Section D, determined to conquer the fear that had driven him off. His tools were still there, just as he'd left them. The shovel on the ground, the pickaxe leaning against an iron cross. He gripped the shovel tightly, planted his feet, and tried again. Nothing. Not a single grain of soil budged. The ground remained smooth, dry, unmoved. Frustrated, he set his coffee thermos on a flat gravestone nearby. He took a few steps toward the digging spot, when, without any breeze, the thermos toppled on its own, as if pushed. The dark liquid stained the dirt, running toward the base of the gravestone. Ramsey spun around. No one. As he bent down to clean up, his foot caught on a thick, twisted root at the plot's edge. A root he could have sworn hadn't been there the day before. He dropped to his knees, scraping his palms on the coarse dirt. The air grew heavier, that pressure on his neck. It felt like something was watching him, not with hatred, but with firm intent. It wasn't a message, it was a presence. And then it clicked. This wasn't about soil anymore. It was the place. That corner of the cemetery didn't want him there. And Ramsey was beginning to understand why. After the incident with the thermos and the fall, he didn't return to Section D that day. Instead, he wandered the paths of the graveyard, brow furrowed, jaw tight, as if searching for a truth that kept slipping through his fingers. His boots dragged through the dry dust as his mind remained trapped in that feeling of rejection, of being an intruder. That's when he saw Miss Charlotte, as he did every week, watering flowers at her husband's grave with a plastic jug. An elderly woman with white hair tied in a bun, always dressed in black, walking slow but speaking with confidence. Everyone at the cemetery knew her. Some said she knew more about the dead than the official records ever did. Ramsey approached her, maybe hoping to vent, maybe just wanting to feel less alone. "Good morning, Miss Charlotte." "Morning, Ramsey. You look like trouble," she said kindly, flashing a warm smile. "The earth giving you a hard time today?" He hesitated for a second, then shrugged. "Something like that. There's a spot way out back, in the old section, where not even a pickaxe gets through. It's like the ground's armored. I've worked here over 30 years, and I've never seen anything like it." Miss Charlotte stopped watering. The stream of water fell silently, soaking the roots of the white chrysanthemum she tended so carefully. She slowly looked up at him, but this time without a smile. "Where exactly?" she asked. "Out back, near the north wall, where those old crosses are, the ones without names." She nodded slowly and lowered her voice. "Be careful, son. There are places in this cemetery that should never be disturbed. Some ground doesn't belong to the living. You can work with respect, with faith. But there are things that have been there longer than we know, and they don't take kindly to being unsettled." Ramsay furrowed his brow. By nature, he was skeptical, but her words struck a chord he hadn't expected. They didn't sound like folklore. They sounded like a warning. "What do you mean?" "There are souls that linger because something won't let them go. And when injustice comes near, they feel it, and they push it away." Miss Charlotte's eyes shifted, as if gazing at something unseen, staring directly towards Section D. A heavy silence followed. Then, almost whispering, she added, "Sometimes the silence of the earth speaks louder than any scream." Ramsay didn't reply. He just nodded. He thanked her with a slight gesture and walked away without turning back, but his steps were slower now, because deep inside, even if he didn't want to admit it, something had shifted. That woman's simple, wise voice had touched on something he couldn't deny, that maybe, just maybe, what was happening wasn't random. After speaking with Miss Charlotte, Ramsay avoided going near Section D for the rest of the day. He spent the afternoon in the newer section of the cemetery, watering plants, sweeping dead leaves, stalling, as if those simple chores could delay the choice that awaited him. He still had to dig that grave. The burial was scheduled for the next morning, and he had no reasonable excuse for why the job hadn't been done. As the sun began to set, he stopped by the small office under the pretense of needing a bag of lime. As he approached the half-open door, he overheard Julian, the manager, speaking on the phone in a rushed tone. "Yes, sir. I promise everything will be ready. Tomorrow at 9 sharp. Your father will be laid to rest with full honors, just as he deserves." "Don't worry." Ramsay froze. "Yes, Mr. Lawrence Esquivel. Absolutely. The cemetery is fully prepared." The name hit him in the gut like a cold brick. Mr. Lawrence Esquivel. The same one. The landowner. The man who had built his wealth on fear and control for decades. Everyone knew about him, though few dared to speak openly. Land seized with threats, employees who vanished without explanation, families displaced at his whim. Even in death, his name still carried weight in local circles. Ramsay's fists clenched before he even realized it. That grave site, the one that wouldn't open, where tools failed, where voices had warned him away, was for him, for Mr. Esquivel. And suddenly, everything made a different kind of sense. It wasn't some fluke of geology. It wasn't coincidence. That ground wasn't rejecting just anyone. It was rejecting him, Lawrence Esquivel. The earth refused to share its peace with a man like that. A chill ran up Ramsay's spine, from his tailbone to the back of his neck. He stepped away from the office without a sound, walking to the edge of the cemetery. There, he leaned on a low stone wall, staring out across the dry fields beyond. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, thinking about what he knew and what still escaped him. Because if the earth truly had a will, if what Miss Charlotte said was true, then this wasn't just a warning. It was a command, a boundary not to be crossed. And yet, tomorrow morning at 9, Mr. Esquivel's family would be there, dressed in black, bearing expensive flowers, speaking empty words. And Ramsay was expected to have dug that grave. His knees buckled. Because for the first time, Ramsay realized that what was at stake wasn't just his job or his reputation. It was something far deeper, and it was buried right there. The next morning, Ramsay arrived early at the cemetery, but he didn't head straight for Section D. He felt exhausted, as if he hadn't slept, though he had laid in bed all night. What he didn't get was rest. He had dreamed of dry soil wrapping around him, of voices whispering his name from the bottom of a grave that didn't exist. Instead of grabbing his tools, he went looking for Thomas, the cemetery watchman, an older man, skin baked by years under the sun, who spent his mornings reading old newspapers and listening to soap operas on the radio. Thomas didn't speak much, but he'd been there nearly as long as Ramsey. If anyone knew the past of that land, it was him. He found him under the shade of a jacaranda tree, feet propped up, coffee half drunk. "Thomas," Ramsey began, lowering his voice, "do you remember if something strange ever happened out back, near the end of the grounds?" The old man looked over his glasses silently. "Strange how?" "I don't know. Like something that doesn't want to be disturbed." Thomas folded the paper slowly. He looked north, towards Section D. He stayed silent for a long moment before finally speaking. "Look, Ramsey, I don't tell this to just anyone, all right? But you've always treated this place with respect." Ramsey nodded without a word. "Old folks used to say that about 100 years ago, a woman was buried out there. They called her Annabelle Basil. She was a healer, the kind that used prayers, teas, wild herbs from the hills, helped people, animals too, never asked for a dime." Ramsey stood still, listening. One of the big ranch owners at the time, full of pride and poison, took an interest in her, wanted her by force. She stood up to him. He got angry, accused her of witchcraft. Back then, that was enough. He paused. A dry leaf tumbled between their feet in the breeze. They killed her, no trial, no name, buried her like a nobody, no cross, no flowers. No one knew the exact spot, but everyone says it was in that section. And since then, that land's resisted every attempt to use it. And when folks tried to force it, strange things happened. Ramsey swallowed hard. He didn't know what to say, but something tightened in his chest. "Annabelle guards that place," Thomas said, lowering his voice even more. "Good people she lets stay. The others, she pushes back." "Pushes how?" "However she needs to." Ramsey stood slowly. He thanked him with a brief glance and walked away. He wandered aimlessly through the cemetery, his thoughts spinning like a broken carousel. The woman's name, her story, it all fit too perfectly, and a new idea began to take shape. Maybe it wasn't him the ground was rejecting. Maybe it was the man meant to go in, and Ramsey was just the wrong messenger. The afternoon heat grew thick and sticky as the sky turned that dusty orange, typical of dry southern summers. Ramsey still hadn't returned to Section D. Thomas's words and Annabelle's story echoed in his mind like distant thunder. Yet deep down, he knew time was running out, and it didn't take long to prove it. A sleek black SUV with tinted windows screeched to a halt in front of the cemetery gate. The tires shrieked through the silence. Out stepped a tall man in a dark suit, face flushed with anger, stride determined. It was Roger Esquivel, son of the late Lawrence. No greeting, no glances. He stormed into the office. From outside, Ramsey heard his voice crash like a storm. "This is disgraceful. My father wasn't some nobody. I demand his grave be ready by tomorrow morning, just like we agreed. If not, I'll sue this place and everyone in it for negligence." "Are we clear?" Julian emerged pale, wiping his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. He walked straight to Ramsey, with a face full of fear and fury. "Ramsey, I don't care what's going on back there. If it's stone, break it. If it's roots, cut them. But that grave needs to be ready before dawn. Or hand in your uniform tonight, got it?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked off, leaving the threat hanging in the hot air. Ramsey didn't move. His throat was dry, his heart beat slow. Decades he'd worked there. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Never had he been forced to choose between the unknown and duty. But now, that's what it was. A choice. And he made it. That night he didn't go home. He didn't call Diane, didn't take his phone. He waited for the cemetery to empty, for the lights to go out, for the silence only night can bring. Then he climbed the back wall like he had in his younger days. His body ached, but he didn't care. He didn't go to the shed for a shovel or pickaxe. He went straight to where the abandoned tools lay, and from there he picked up the sledgehammer, the heaviest one. He wasn't going to negotiate with the earth, he was going to force it. He crossed the cemetery with firm steps. The moon slipped behind heavy clouds, no wind, no sound, just the echo of his footsteps and Julian's voice ringing in his mind. Dig it or leave. And even though part of him knew something didn't want to be touched there, that night Ramsey chose not to listen. At 3:20 a.m., Ramsey crossed the last row of graves before the back wall. The sledgehammer rested on his shoulder, his back hunched, muscles taut. The air hung still, as if time itself had paused. Not a single cricket, not even the crunch of a leaf. The silence was so complete, he could hear his own breath, deep, restrained. He reached the exact spot. The stake was still there, standing like a warning post. The tools he'd abandoned were where he'd left them, now coated in dust and dew. He stood before the stubborn ground, staring for a few seconds. Then he spat into his palms, like he always had, and with a mechanical motion, raised the sledgehammer high above his head. And just as his arms came down, the distant cemetery lights, those few yellow vapor lamps lining the paths, flickered twice, then went out. Darkness swallowed everything. Ramsey froze. The sledgehammer still hung in the air. A chill, unnatural and bone-deep, slid down Ramsey's back. It wasn't the coolness of a late-night breeze. It was colder, older, a frost that seemed to rise from the very core of the ground beneath him. And then he saw her. Just a few feet ahead, right in front of him, something began to take shape. Not entirely solid, not entirely mist. A feminine silhouette, softly contoured, wrapped in a pale, almost translucent light. She didn't walk, she didn't float, she simply was, as though she had always been there. Ramsey couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even think. His eyes were locked on the figure, something that didn't belong to this world, yet carried no threat. It was pure presence, contained sorrow, living memory. Then he heard the voice, not with his ears, in his mind. One word, short, sharp, undeniable. Enough. The sledgehammer flew from his hands as if torn away by invisible force. It shot into the darkness and slammed into a nearby headstone with a crack that shattered the silence into fragments. Ramsey screamed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't long. It was a strangled, high-pitched gasp, like his throat had clenched shut. He dropped to his knees. His body trembled, his heart pounded like a war drum. His legs refused to move. His breathing came in jagged bursts, his eyes blurred. He scrambled backward like a frightened child, grazing stone, stumbling over the same route that had tripped him before. And then he ran. No direction, no plan. Through pathways, over graves, his clothes torn, his thoughts shattered. He never looked back. He didn't want to know if the figure was still there, because deep in his soul, he already knew she was. By dawn, Diana woke with a tight knot in her stomach. Ramsey hadn't come home. No call, no note. His side of the bed untouched. She tried not to panic immediately. He sometimes stayed late at the cemetery during busy weeks. But never, in 30 years, had he failed to check in. At 7:30 a.m., Diane called the cemetery office. Julian answered, his tone clipped. He said he hadn't seen Ramsey, assumed he was finishing up the grave in the old section for Mr. Esquivel. But when he went to check, what he found didn't look like a job site. The stake was still planted, the grave untouched, the ground unmarked. Nearby, tools lay scattered in the dust, including the sledgehammer embedded deep in the dirt as if hurled with inhuman force. No signs of struggle, no blood, no recent footprints, just emptiness. The local police were called. 2 patrol cars arrived with a couple of officers and a tracking dog. They searched the cemetery, the perimeter, even the dry canal behind the wall. Nothing, no trace of Ramsey. Rumors spread among the living. Some claimed he'd fled out of fear of being fired. Others suggested he'd suffered an episode and stumbled into the wilderness. But among the cemetery workers, those who whispered what never made it into reports, everyone knew that wasn't the truth. Ramsey wasn't the kind of man to run. Not without his hat, not without saying, "I'll be right back." Mr. Esquivel's burial was delayed. His son Roger pressured the administration, furious, until another site was chosen. The body was eventually laid to rest in the newer section near the founder's mausoleum, a place they called more visible, more honorable, more fitting. Section D was closed off for the time being. Julian refused to speak about it. Thomas's hands shook every time someone asked if Ramsey had any enemies, and Miss Charlotte, the eternal widow, began placing white flowers at the entrance to the path that led to the forgotten section. No one asked her to. No one mentioned it. She just did, as if she knew something needed to be left in peace. The case was shelved in less than a month, a disappearance without evidence, no suspects, no body, and no explanation. Over time, the story was passed down in whispers to the new cemetery workers. There used to be a man here who once dug where he shouldn't have and never came back. The words drifted among the trees, echoed off rusty crosses, slipped through cracks in the old graves. But no one, ever, spoke his name aloud, as if doing so might bring him back, or worse, as if doing so might keep him from leaving. Weeks passed. Ramsey's name faded from the records, from the rosters, from the shift schedules. His locker sat empty. His uniform, folded neatly in a plastic bag, lay forgotten in a corner of the office. No one claimed his post. No one volunteered to work that area. Section D was first avoided, then officially closed. But people still talked. Thomas no longer patrolled the northern edge of the cemetery. He changed his nightly route, never glancing toward that part of the grounds. His portable radio no longer played dramas. It played instrumental music now, like he needed to drown out the silence with something less human. Miss Charlotte kept coming every Tuesday to visit her husband's grave, but after Ramsey vanished, she made one more stop. Before leaving, she'd pause at the fork that led to the forgotten path. There, she'd leave a small bouquet, usually white wallflowers. She'd stand a few seconds, clutching her hat to her chest, and whisper something no one ever heard. A thank you, a forgive me, or maybe just a quiet, "I'm still here." The new staff never asked questions. A single glance at the older employees' faces was enough to understand. That section was off limits. Tools were stored, tasks were rotated, but Section D remained untouched. The crooked tombstones stayed buried under dust, weeds, and silence. And yet, not everything was still. Every now and then, at dusk, when the setting sun painted the crosses orange, and the southern breeze began to stir, some claimed they heard footsteps. Not heavy, not sure. Dragging steps, like someone strolling without hurry between the graves. A shovel slung over their shoulder. Others swore they heard the scrape of metal against dry soil. One new groundskeeper, a young man from Tennessee, swore he saw a figure crouching by a wooden stake. When he went to check, no one was there. Just a wilted flower on the ground. He never went back there alone. No one made him, because an unspoken rule had settled over the place. A silent pact. That ground already had a guardian with no uniform, no name, a man who had become part of the very soil he once tried to command, and now kept watch in silence, from a distance, from the shadows, from that invisible layer between the world of the living and those still waiting for justice. At Hope Grove Cemetery, among twisted roots and rusted crosses, Ramsey was no longer a worker. He was memory, he was warning, he was the echo of a whisper still carried on the wind. And those who know the story never again dared to dig where the earth had said no.